So this is a message going out to Lauren Southern and Stefan Molyneux. Now, I'd like to explain to you why the reason is you didn't get a very popular reception when you came to New Zealand Aotearoa. Is when you first got off the plane, is you started to mock our national culture from the photo. As you may know, we have an ethnic war dance called the haka, and you were standing below a Māori carving, and it looked like from that photo that you were trying to clean windows and you were trying to mock our national culture. Now, many New Zealanders first saw this and they would have thought, yeah, they're trying to do a silly haka and they're trying to ridicule our national culture, and that's just not good enough. So you got off to a really bad start coming to Aotearoa, New Zealand, just doing silly shenanigans, and you maybe want to avoid that when you're a guest of another nation. Now, I'd like to explain to you the real reason why you were not welcome in the power station venue in Mount Eden. Now, Auckland City is a population of over 1 million people. It is actually the world's biggest Polynesian city in the world. So in the South Auckland part, there in Manukau, it has roughly a population of 800,000 Polynesian people. Now, the power station has many gigs, bands and performances by Polynesians that are the economy of that venue, the power station. And because you kept the venue secret right up into the bitter end, was once their customer base found out that you were hosting it at the powerhouse, they were not happy at all. And so they contacted the manager and they go, what are you doing having white supremacists in our favourite venue? Can you please cancel the event? And the owner would have thought, well, long term economically, this is a sound judgment. I can't just have these one-off white supremacists here. I really need to look after my main customer base, who are many are Polynesian customers. And so it was an economic decision. It had absolutely nothing to do with he was threatened or terrorism or some of the other fantasies that you've created that as the reason why you were not entitled to have as your venue. Now, you've mentioned that you think that it was terrorism and it was violent and it was scary why you were denied to host your venue in the powerhouse. Well, I'd like to explain to you that it actually had nothing to do with terrorism. In fact, New Zealand doesn't have a domestic terrorism problem. We did have a terrorism committed by the French Stefan Molyneux. They came and attacked us once in Auckland Harbour and blew up a boat called the Rainbow Warrior. But we don't seem to have a Islamic terrorism issue, because the Muslim community in New Zealand make up about 1% of our population. Therefore, they're outnumbered 100 to 1. And it's highly unlikely that Sharia law will be imposed in New Zealand, or that small minority of 1% of New Zealanders is going to create a jihad, have a jihad or revolution, and form the Caliphate of Aotearoa. We sleep soundly knowing that won't happen at all. I'm pretty confident. Yeah, not going to happen at all. So, in your interview here in New Zealand, you gave yourself a free pass from having hate speech, that you just said that hate speech just doesn't exist. Well, I'd like to actually explain to you that hate speech does exist here in New Zealand, and we have it defined in Section 61 of the Human Rights Act. It's actually been defined, and it is based on if you're creating animosity towards anyone based on their religion or their race. So you would have breached the law anyhow if you had spoken at the powerhouse, and you probably would have been prosecuted. So you really should be thankful that the Auckland community and New Zealanders stopped your event from going forward. I mean, you need to show us some gratitude for saving your butts here, really. But what you are actually doing in hate speech is you are actually making hate speech. Now, Stefan, what you do is you talk about an ideology called eugenics. Now, what eugenics is, it's where you propose that the majority, this is what Adolf Hitler did. He proposed that the German majority was superior to an ethnic minority, the Jewish people. Now, what he did is he managed to convince the majority of the German population to exterminate the Jewish minority, and it's a really dangerous ideology, eugenics. And the reason why New Zealanders don't like this idea of eugenics is because and during World War II, we sent many young men overseas to fight against the Nazis and the fascists so that they would stop the industrial extermination of the Jewish people. And many of our soldiers died in European battlefields. So we're not really enthusiastic about hearing about eugenics. Also, I like to explain to you that eugenics just doesn't exist for a personal level for me, because I'm actually half Māori. I have Māori DNA and I have European British DNA, and I know that my British ancestry or heritage is no more superior to my Māori heritage. And how I know this is that Polynesians, my forebearers, they actually discovered Asia, Aotearoa New Zealand, North America and South America 500 years before Europeans. So I'm pretty confident that my Māori heritage is no less inferior to my British heritage in any way, shape or form. Now, Lauren, you also explained that New Zealand is a Western culture, a Western nation. Now, I like to explain to you that New Zealand is not at all a Western nation. When we signed our nation's founding national document, the Treaty of Waitangi, it was actually an invitation for people from the Western Hemisphere to immigrate to Aotearoa New Zealand. There was no colonial conquest that happened like in your own nation, Canada. It was actually an invitation by the indigenous population. Now, you've explained that New Zealand is a Western civilization. If you were to look at a map of the world, New Zealand is actually the most eastern nation on earth. We are at the east of the timeline. In fact, you can't get any more east than New Zealand. So back in Canada, you may want to go to a geography teacher or look at a map, and it will show you how far east New Zealand is. In fact, we are more east than China. So yeah, you really want to have a look at a map there, Lauren. It's we're not a Western nation. We are completely an Eastern nation. Now, you also explained that the Māori people should be grateful for British civilization, because had of Genghis Khan come out to Aotearoa New Zealand and colonised it, that the Māori people would have had a much worse fate. Well, I like to explain to you that Māori New Zealanders should absolutely have no gratitude for British colonisation at all in any way, shape or form. And here's the reason why. Because Genghis Khan was not, and the Mongol hordes, they were not a seafaring civilization. In fact, when they tried to cross the Sea of Japan from China to Japan to invade Japan, they got wiped out just in the sea journey. where they were not like the Polynesian people, who were the greatest seafarers in human history, who could make it out here. They just didn't have the technology or the know-how on celestial navigation to make it out to this part of the world. So if you're expecting Māori New Zealanders to have gratitude for British colonial benevolence, no, that probably will never happen, because we don't subscribe to alternative histories where they're based on fantasy. So it's just like me saying, well, what if the Martians from the planet Mars had turned up? Things would have been very different for the Māori people. These alternative histories and fantasies, well, they're just really silly and ridiculous. Now, Lauren, you also explained how you are against biculturalism and multiculturalism. Well, New Zealand is one of the first nations on earth that has really taken on board multiculturalism, and that can be seen in our national rugby team, the All Blacks. Now, the All Blacks, when they go to play a game of rugby, what they do is they do the Māori war dance called the haka, and the reason why the New Zealand All Blacks are so successful is because they do this war dance, the haka, and it intimidates their opposition, and that's why they are the most successful sports team in history. They have more wins than any of your hockey teams back in Canada. So New Zealanders as a whole are really proud of our national rugby team. They're proud of their success, and so we actually embrace multiculturalism and biculturalism in this country, and to come out here and to tell us to cut it out, get those All Blacks to stop doing that haka and intimidating the other team and winning your rugby games. It's just not going to happen. We're not going to stop biculturalism, multiculturalism, because it's working for us and it's successful. So yeah, that's why your message isn't going to go down too well with all New Zealanders. Also, you've had a go at, when you're on your Australian tour of your leg of your tour, you've had a go at the First Nation people of Australia, the Australian Aboriginal people, and Stefan said that the Australian Aboriginal people, they were into, before the arrival of the British colonists, they were into mass rape and mass murder, and the Aboriginal people say that the British were only there to steal their land. Well, I'd like to refute your version of Australian history. Now, I can actually talk from personal experience on this. Is my great-great-grandfather, Charles Trinder, he was living in the United Kingdom, and he stole 11 rabbits. And he was prosecuted by a judge, and he was sent to the penal colony of Australia. And Australia was the prison for Great Britain, and they sent a lot of prisoners out there. Now, if you wanted to stop mass rape amongst the Indigenous population of Australia, well, you wouldn't send prisoners to a mass raping. It would just create more rape. And so I think that your theories on the Australian Aborigine people, you may need to really live amongst them, meet them, and get to understand them before giving your opinion that's just based on nothing really. It's yeah. Also, the the British colonists that arrived, they started exterminating the Australian Aboriginal people, and you can see that there has been a level of extermination of the Aboriginal people, because they have a very small population and they were on a large continent, the continent of Australia. Australia is huge. Now, the Australian Aboriginal population today only equals about 500,000 people. In fact, they have a smaller population than the Māori population who live in New Zealand Aotearoa in a smaller landmass, and only arrived in New Zealand approximately in the year 1350 AD, whereas the Australian Aboriginal people had been living in the continent of Australia before British colonists for 65,000 years. So someone's been out there doing a bit of exterminating of Aboriginal people, and so when you try to portray that the Australian Aboriginal people are, they're primitive to the British people, that's kind of offensive. Yeah, considering you've never been amongst Australian Aboriginal people. Now, I'd also like to explain, actually the same thing happened to Māori New Zealanders here in New Zealand. There was a level of extermination of the Māori population for land, and the British Army was brought into the city of Auckland, and they were marched down into an area called the Waikato, where I am now. Here's the Waikato River, and thousands of Māori were actually exterminated for land acquisition for British colonists. And so what happened is they had race-based privilege, where land was transferred from Māori people to the British colonists who were immigrants, and it hasn't been returned ever since. So it hasn't been a very good experience for the Māori people, this superior Western civilization and colonization that you praise so much. So you may want to review that when you get back to Canada, Stefan. Now, you also explained that the Māori people need to be grateful for the advances in Western society that they've received. And, there should be, in my opinion, there should actually be no gratitude at all, because the Māori population of New Zealand have actually had to fight tooth and nail for every single advance in New Zealand society. So they'd have to go through the court system to get Māori television, or they would have to get a Māori MP to become the Minister of Health, so that they could actually have access to public health. So Māori have never been gifted anything on a platter from British colonisation. They had to fight for every last part and privilege that British New Zealanders automatically and British colonists automatically awarded themselves by default. So your opinions on New Zealand history, they're just tragically wrong, and you may need to review your understanding of New Zealand history. You also complained about $56 million being awarded to the Ministry of Māori Affairs here in New Zealand. Well, the thing here in New Zealand is that the Māori population, they actually pay taxes. So it only is quite fitting that because they pay taxes, that they actually have some of those taxes awarded back to them. It only seems fair to me that if you pay taxes, that you receive some of your taxes back. You also mentioned in your interview with in New Zealand that historical grievances just need to be bygones, and that we need to, here in New Zealand, we just need to forget about all the historical wrongs that have happened in New Zealand. Well, no one in New Zealand is actually blaming the ancestors of the British colonists that have passed away. What they're actually asking for is the systems of oppression that the British colonists set up, that oppress the Māori population, that their descendants of the British colonists today are benefiting from. And that's only fair. That's civil rights. That's equality.